want to do? Okay, you guys. So we are going to wrap up here today, and we're going to look specifically at management of the economy. This isn't really something we've always done. It's not something that the voters have always had an expectation if the economy goes bad, that the government does something about that. We're very much rooted in that idea of individualism and free market economy. I would say that the Great Depression really became a major turning point because, suddenly, you have people out of work and no longer can their families take care of them, and so the expectation became that the government would do that. So from that, we move into this idea that the president will become the chief guardian of the economy, and Congress will use their tools to create jobs and things like that. And so that's why we have these categories of fiscal policy and monetary policy. Mr. Harklaw taught you about these, I know, in incredible depth. He did entire units on it. So you don't need to know for my class what you needed to know for his. What you need to think about for our class is what are the political implications of that. And I know that he exposed you to that as well because I've been friends with him long enough to know. Okay? So what we want to talk about though is how are they different? So when you think about fiscal policy, that's real specifically the president and the Congress using taxing and spending to try to affect the economy somehow, some way. And remember, there's all those schools of thought where there's people that say just, affect supply, get out of the economy, and be, support wealthy, support consumers and producers, and that will help the economy to grow. There's others that talk about directly affecting the money that's flowing. A real good example of fiscal policy, after 9/11, in October of that year, President Bush and the Congress issued an early tax rebate. Every taxpayer in America got a $300 check in the mail. Aaliyah, what do you think they wanted us to do with that $300?
Spend it.
Yeah, because consumers, the middle class, is what drives the economy in America, right? And so if the middle class is freaked out and they're not going to the mall and they're not going to restaurants and they're not going to movies, we're going to have a real problem. And so $300 in the scope of things is not that big a deal, but it was $300 check, and people were having a lot of feelings. My now husband, then boyfriend, we went to Disney World, which is totally silly and ridiculous, but we did, because that's the most anti-9/11 place we could think of. So that was the hope, and that's what they were trying to do, okay? Nikita, what is hard about fiscal policy? What's the problem of it? Okay, let's talk through this. Who is implementing fiscal policy? Okay, so the Congress and the President, very specifically. How do Congress and the President get their jobs? Right, they're voted, okay? So tell me what might cause them trouble with the voters in relationship to fiscal policy.
The voters might not agree with fiscal policy.
What kind of fiscal policy might they have trouble with? The tax rebate, I loved, right? $300, woo! Okay, what might the voters not be so excited about? If you go the other way, right? If you raise taxes, so if we're in a period of inflation and the government says, you know what, we got to slow consumer spending. We need to raise taxes on people. Nobody likes that. People get mad. They respond negatively, even if it's the appropriate fiscal policy response. So the problem with fiscal policy is you're asking people who depend on public opinion to keep their jobs to use an economic response, which might keep them from keeping their jobs. And so that's difficult. Plus, we have people who are very ideologically driven, who always say cut taxes, cut taxes, cut taxes, because we have become so we've become so driven about anti-taxes that when somebody says, but that's what I think would help the economy, immediately that could mean, they're going to lose their jobs, basically. Monetary policy. So in my 3A class, we had a little bit of confusion about this. Monetary policy is conducted by the Federal Reserve. You guys talked about the Fed. I know. A lot, right? I know. So the Federal Reserve is the chief bank of the United States. Well, it's actually part of the government, right? What part of the government would it be? Which branch of government?
Isn't it the executive?
It is part of the executive branch. So, because they're enforcing law. If our law, like Congress can authorize debt, well, the Federal Reserve is the one who's going to manage that debt, who's going to buy and sell that debt. Well, now we buy and sell debt to manage the economy, right? We set the reserve requirement, banks make loans to other banks. So remember you learned about all that open market operations and right? Is this coming back? Okay. All right. So, the Federal Reserve is absolutely part of the government, but remember earlier I said that OMB is the part of the government that the president has total control over? The Federal Reserve is the part of the bureaucracy that the president has the least control over. They are so removed from the presidency. The president, here I'll show you guys this chart. Whoops. Keep going. Okay. The president appoints, so if you think back to when you guys learned about the organization of the Fed, the board of governors are going to be the people who set policy, right? They're the ones that are going to decide we're in an expansion, we're in a contraction, we need to affect policy somehow, some way. So the board of governors, and that would include the chair of the Federal Reserve, they are going to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Every 4 years, every 4 years, the chair of the Federal Reserve is up for, they could be reappointed. Twice a year, the chair of the Federal Reserve has to give a report to Congress on the state of the economy, but that's it. So it's not like there's this constant interaction. It's not like the president is looking over the chair of the Federal Reserve's shoulder, checking up to see what they're doing. And in fact, we have actually had situations where the chair of the Federal Reserve, I remember this distinctly under Alan Greenspan didn't like the Bush tax cuts that were put in place, and he said they were bad for the economy, and he didn't like them. Well, his position comes up for renewal, and you would expect, well, I'm not going to appoint that dude anymore. But Alan Greenspan was really popular, and the economy was really good, and so W still appoints him to his job, even though he had been critical of his economic policy. So truly, there is so much more autonomy from the government. It's still part of the government, but they're really very autonomous and removed from politics. Megan, why do you think it would be important to the creators of the Fed? Why would it be important for them to be removed from politics, do you think?
So that there was a division of power, and so the people that had control over the fiscal policy didn't have as much control over the fiscal policy.
I like that. That makes sense. Mike?
If parties in the Fed were intertwined, then party polarization could lead to extreme changes in the economy over a short period of time.
And that's kind of scary, when you think about that's your money. I mean, they don't print the money, but they control the flow of it, they control the supply of it. There's a lot of stability that comes with the Federal Reserve that if you enter politics into it, that could become a little scary. So that's basically it when we look at, how it's conducted. If you need practice, if you need to kind of go back and look and think about, okay, how does this work and the two sides? There is a simulation in your textbook, and we were going to do it today, but it's not working. So if you feel like you want to look back at it, it's not anything new. It's just looking at it not so much from the economic perspective, but more from the government decisions that you would make. So feel free, it's there, it's linked on the Learning Hub. I'll just leave that up to you, and I'm sorry, it's just not working today. Okay?
Can you go back to the one before the chart?
Do you want to ask me about any of that? Oh, before one more time?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's just the definition of monetary policy. Do you remember all of that?
No.
Kinda?
Kind of. I remember if you had we knew what you had to do if you had a recession or inflation, you would buy or sell bonds or raise them.
And I'm not going to ask you that. You don't need to know all of that. I mean, you need to know it in a couple months. You can take your AP test, but I'm not going to ask you that. Just remember, it's always the contrary, right? You're always trying to counteract whatever force is happening. Okay? All right, so then our last part of this is we want to look at income security. So again, not always something that we've expected before. Your second cousin loses his job and falls on hard times, and they all come live with your family until they get back on their feet, or your grandparents your grandparents retire and they don't have any money, well, they come and live with you. I mean, if you notice that, there's a lot of other cultures that they do that, where the younger generation takes care of the older generation. And I really feel like a big part of when that changed in America was the Great Depression, because our younger generation couldn't take care of them anymore. And then we have all the New Deal legislation. So the two things we want to focus on are the difference, our Social Security, and then we'll look at Medicare and Medicaid. So remember that Social Security was a component of the New Deal legislation. Michael, what is Social Security? Like, what's it for? Do you know?
Yeah, you just give money
To who?
elderly.
Okay, it's money for old people,
Yeah,
right?
and retired and like disabled people.
Good, good, absolutely right.
It takes, doesn't take like a certain chunk of your current income to add to like your retirement income?
That's what it's supposed to be. Yeah. So all of you that have jobs right now, there's money that's being taken out of your paycheck, unless it has been changed. It's 6.2%. So you pay 6.2%, and Cameron Sprouts pays 6.2%, and all of this money is going into an account that has this Cameron Social Security number. Okay. And periodically, you're going to get statements from Social Security Administration that says this is how much money's been paid in. And theoretically, when you retire, based on your current earnings, this is what you can expect in terms of a payout, right? So here's the deal, though. It's not really being held. Remember last class we were talking about the debt, and I'm not sure if it was in your class, like we had discrepancies about what people think the debt is. Some people say it's like 19 trillion, and some say it's like 15 trillion, which who cares at that point? But what they're looking, there's this thing called the Social Security Trust Fund, where that money is being, like, on paper, we know, okay, there's this much money being paid into Social Security, but it's a pay-ahead system. So the money that's being paid in is then going to my grandma, or your grandma, or like whoever it is that you know in your life. Remember, like Michael said too, Social Security is also for people who are disabled, who are unable to work, but it's not just, like there's a series of parameters. It's not like you just, broke my leg. It's also, there's a survivor's benefit, so if you're a minor and your parents die, you might be eligible to some kind of Social Security benefit. There's a spousal benefit, so if your spouse dies, you could be entitled to their Social Security payment, like stuff like that, okay? So when we talk about Social Security and how it has changed, I wanted to show you guys a couple of charts just so you can see like what the evolution is like. Okay. First of all, when we look at the effectiveness of Social Security, probably one of the things it's done is it has helped to keep old people off the streets, that they're not in poverty anymore. When you look at this, it shows you that in the late 1990s, only about 10% of the elderly population lived in poverty, which compared to 40 years prior, 35%. That's huge, So obviously it's like doing part of what it's supposed to be doing. However, this shows you what's happening in our country. We've talked about this already when we talked about voting. In 1946, 8% of our population was over 65, which was the age of eligibility of Social Security. I do want to point out that in the creation of, when Social Security was created, the average lifespan for a man was 59 years old. So the age of eligibility was 65, but we didn't expect that most men would even make it to 65, let alone, life expectancy right now for a man is like 76 and then like 78 for women. And that's for current people. I don't even know what it's going to be for your generation. You guys stop drinking Monster probably, but so now if you look today in 2030, the expectation in 2030 is that 20% of the population, so 2 out of every 10 people will be over 65. So currently eligible for Social Security. Although it's not quite 65 for some people, it's 67. It's but it's kind of in that range. Why are there going to be, Chris, so many people over 65?
Baby boomers.
Okay, what's that mean?
There's a lot of babies born.
Mm-hmm.
I thought those were already, that they were coming in.
Say it again?
I thought those were already, like, the people from the baby boom were
Yeah,
already.
they're already.
They are,
yeah.
but they're getting there. It's like getting bigger. My parents are probably the tail end of that generation, and they're 62. So, okay. Why else? There's another reason. Mike.